Hi, guys. Welcome back. I just wanted to have my ideas mature on this a little before I give out my reaction to it. What I think is Fareed got it right. A few weeks ago, Fareed Zakaria released the Washington Post column, which he puts out as Fareed's take in the opening of his weekly CNN program. It was a pretty grounded, middle of the road kind of analysis on what's going on in the war in Gaza. I just wanted to pop in and out, tell you my take on different segments of his commentary. Without further ado, let's look into his commentary. Roll it.
It's now almost 3 months since Benjamin Netanyahu's government's ground invasion of Gaza began. And it is time to ask some hard questions. Has it been proportional to the damage that Hamas inflicted on Israel? Has the Israeli government been careful to avoid civilian casualties? Was there another path? I ask this as a supporter of Israel, a country that I believe has been a remarkable success in an environment that was for decades deeply hostile to it, and where some countries like Iran remain opposed to its very existence. I'm also
Not just countries, but people too. I think it's an anti Semitic call. Why would you only call for Israel not to exist? Do you call for the downfall of England, Hungary, China, Chad? No. They single out the Jewish state. Go on.
dismayed and appalled by the rise of anti-Semitism across the world, which is a powerful reminder as to why Israel was founded in the first place. This week, hearings in the International Court of Justice began to determine if Israel's government is committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. I think the charge is invalid. There is no systematic effort to exterminate Gaza's population. If there were, given the vast disparity in power, Israel would surely have killed many more than 23,000 people, though of course that number is still staggeringly high.
So, back in 2015, I took a course in Tel Aviv University where a pretty left of center professor taught the course. And he said if we really wanted to wipe out Gaza, we would line up tanks across the Gaza border and just hit reverse. That would be a genocidal act. That's not what's being done here. While maybe not as surgical as we non military or mostly non military people can imagine, Israel's going in with some regard to human life. Unlike when Hamas came out genocidally, and as long as you were on the other side of that border, they were going to kill your ass. So, when it comes to the claim of genocide at the ICJ, I also studied the UN pretty deeply in my undergraduate life. I took part in a few different hearings at the UN, and it was a really engaging course. I never thought that that scholarship would come into use in a situation like this. I didn't just read coverage of what each side presented at the ICJ. I watched the entire argument by both sides, including the reading of the ruling. I couldn't help but see what both sides had to say. The South African case really rested on the invocation of Amalek, a biblical commandment of genocide that the Jews should be committing unto the nation of Amalek. I'm going to leave the morality of God commanding genocide to the religious scholars and biblical thinkers. But I'll tell you something that I learned as a little Jewish boy. My rabbi taught me what Amalek did wrong was show the world that you can screw around with the Israelites and the Jewish nation. God took the Israelites out of Egypt with a strong hand, showing the world strength and miracles. But Amalek knew they were going to lose to the Jewish nation. After all, they had the God that took them out of Egypt defending them. But they wanted to show that this God is not impenetrable. He is not all powerful. We can start up with them. So they did. They lost. But for that, God declares genocide on that nation. Whether you see any parallels between the almighty Israeli Defense Forces compared to the pesky Hamas fighters, and Hamas just trying to prove a point, hey, we're going to show the world that you're not all you're pumped up to be. It's possible. But again, I'm not a biblical scholar, but that sort of anecdote that I learned as a kid really came back when all of this came to light. South Africa's case really relies on the annihilation of Hamas being conflated with the annihilation of the Palestinian people. So I believe it's really invalid based on that. Israeli soldiers chanting, we're going to go and smite them just like we were supposed to smite Amalek. The them is not open to all Palestinians. If you want to choose some quotes from far right ministers like Ben Gvir or Smotrich that say we should wipe out all the Palestinians, the way it works in Israel under that legislation and that sort of government structure, ministers don't speak for the entire government. Ministers are factions of a government coalition that represent their own party's views. And really, it's not like the American system where the whole cabinet is based on just one presidency in a two-party system. So taking that into account, the diversity and different way of governance in Israel, that can definitely help you understand that side of things. But to be fair to South Africa, acting as the legal wing of Hamas, it's pretty hard to deny that's what they're doing. If they wanted the court to impose a ceasefire on Israel, what does that say? Give Hamas more time to regroup, re-energize, and reorganize? The numbers are really high. The tragedy is skyrocketing. At the time of this recording, the IDF is waiting at Rafah, giving the opposition just 19 days or so to give up whatever hostages they have, as they should have done a while ago. Back to the video.
The death toll, I should note, comes from the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza. Genocide is an incendiary accusation that should not be used loosely. Nevertheless, some deeply troubling facts may emerge about Israel's bombing campaign. Israel suffered a brutal terrorist attack on October 7th and had the right to respond forcefully. But consider what it has done in a small territory housing 2.2 million people, half of whom are children, and of which, by Israel's own estimate before the war, only 30,000 are Hamas fighters. A Wall Street Journal analysis of Israel's bombing campaign.
It's worth noting, 30,000 of which were Hamas fighters, but those 30,000 were not the only parties who partook in the October 7th terrorist attacks. There were plenty of other non-uniformed, non-Hamas Gazans who saw it as a free-for-all. And those people are definitely not innocent in this. It's important to keep that in mind.
Notes that by mid-December, nearly 70% of Gaza's 439,000 homes and about half of all its buildings have been damaged or destroyed. Much of the water, electrical communications, and healthcare infrastructure that made Gaza function is beyond repair. Of Gaza's 36 hospitals, only 8 can still accept patients. UN monitors report that more than 2/3 of all schools have been damaged, as have several churches and over 100 mosques. The Associated Press reports that, according to experts, in roughly 2 months, Israel caused more destruction in Gaza than the Battle of Aleppo in Syria or the razing of Mariupol in Ukraine, and killed.
One thing to note that Israel, they knew Hamas was embedded within the civilian population. Hamas knew they were embedded within the civilian population. They spent 16 years and billions of dollars in aid to further entrench themselves in the civilian population. Hamas knew exactly what Israel's reaction would have been. Israel was simply faced with two options in response to October 7th. Go in and do some form of whatever's happening now, or do nothing. The first option is not pretty, as you just saw. The second, no country would ever stand for something like that. Not after the gruesome acts that just happened. So this is what Piers Morgan calls his moral quandary. Let's head back to it.
I think we are with this. I also acknowledge that Hamas live amongst civilian population in Gaza, and therefore if you do what the Israelis are currently doing, which is a ground offensive into Gaza, a lot of civilians are going to get killed. And at what point does that become disproportionate or even illegal? And I don't know the answers to those questions. And I have a moral quandary because my instinct is to say that Israel has no choice but to respond to what happened in a very forceful manner.
More civilians than the U.S. and its allies did in a 3-year campaign against ISIS. Israel's campaign has exceeded proportionally the destruction of the Allied bombings of Germany in World War II, and as the University of Chicago's Robert Pape notes, is one of the most intense civilian punishment campaigns in history. CNN reported in mid-December that U.S. intelligence estimated that
one of the most hard to defend claims is that whatever's happening in Gaza now is a form of collective punishment. I don't think so, just because of the mere fact Israel is much more considerate about human life than really any other army I know of, and that's just based on the 2-to-1 ratio of civilians killed to combatants being much better than the U.S. in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that was the next best. I think that was 4-to-1. You could definitely check me on that and let me know in the comments below. The whole collective punishment thing it's troubling for me. I don't know the legal definition, but I do know that, let's say, the collective Gazan people are being punished for Hamas's actions. I guess the counter argument to that is that they elected Hamas. Hamas represents their interests, and this is exactly what they wanted. So there's no collective punishment because of some insurgent group. This is the duly elected government of the Gazan people. It's a very unfortunate thing to think, especially now with over 1 million people just stuck in one city, and they're about to take that too. It's such a sad situation.
40 to 45% of the 29,000 bombs Israel had dropped were unguided, prone.
It's important to note, unguided doesn't mean not aimed. It doesn't mean indiscriminate, like the Hamas rockets do when they come over the other side,
to cause greater collateral damage. Prime Minister Netanyahu has evoked the biblical story of Amalek, in which God tells the Israelites to kill every man, woman, and child, destroy all property, even kill every animal in retaliation for a surprise attack. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that more journalists have been killed in the first 10 weeks of the Israel-Gaza war than have ever been killed in a single country over an entire year.
So something I actually learned in the beginning of this conflict, it's amazing to see or put in some research on how many journalists are in Israel during peacetime and how much that outnumbers the rest of the nation or the rest of the world. So that was just an interesting fact that came to mind there. The journalists being killed, I mean, who are you going to consider journalists is a question that comes to mind. People who reported for Al Jazeera, even some freelancers who reported for the New York Times were engaged in the October 7th attacks. Something to think about too.
The United Nations reports that more UN aid workers have been killed in Gaza than in any other conflict over the 78 years of the organization.
We now know UN workers were part of the 10/7 attacks, not just the 12 that were confirmed, but Hillel Neuer of UN Watch reporting over 3,000 UN workers, part of a Telegram group glorifying the violence against Jews.
It's possible that some of these numbers are misleading, but are all of them coming from various sources wrong?
No.
This military campaign is being perpetrated by a deeply unpopular government in Jerusalem that is trying to salvage its reputation.
You can't dispute that.
Polls since the start of this conflict have shown that most of the Israeli public has lost faith in Prime Minister Netanyahu. A poll that came out last week found that only...
Who wouldn't? This guy's whole political career is based on security, 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 and 10/7 happens under his watch. There's no reason why his poll numbers shouldn't be in the tank. That's the simple reality of it.
Only 15% of those surveyed wanted Bibi Netanyahu to keep his job after the war.
Maybe it's
69% wanted elections as soon as the war ends. It is awkward to note this, but Prime Minister Netanyahu has every incentive to keep the military campaign going in the hope that
That's my worried. Let me finish this.
his day of reckoning can be postponed, if not put off indefinitely. Having bungled the strategy toward Hamas before the war, he is trying to use maximum force now as political compensation.
That's my worry. Netanyahu knows his days are numbered, or under normal circumstances, his days are numbered. There are comparisons to Golda Meir when the Yom Kippur War happened. Her resignation was imminent. Same thing goes for him. But contrary to Golda, he has one interest, and that's for himself. We saw him drag Israel through 5 different elections, even through a pandemic that which didn't even startle him. And the only thing he had top of mind was himself and his premiership. It frightens me to think, what would he do when it comes to war to stay in power? Technically, he can stay in power until the end of his term, which is really as long as the ultra right-wing extremists who are part of his government stay a part of his government. If that falls, so does the government. But until then, he's prime minister. Gets me frightened.
Israel is a democracy and an open society, and precisely because of that, it will one day have to ask itself whether it acted appropriately in the heat of its anger and sorrow after October 7th. Friends of Israel should help it ask those questions now, so that it does not look back on this episode with shame and regret.
I consider myself a friend of Israel. I love Israel. Israel is a miracle that God blessed this generation with to bring technology, life-saving medicine, and innovation at a rate, when looked at in comparison to other nations in their history, is truly unparalleled. The textbook definition of it. I also consider myself privileged to grow up in a world where Jews have a state and an army of their own. As a friend of Israel, I think this bloodshed and violence cannot go on endlessly. Hamas does need to be annihilated. A message needs to be sent to the neighbors in the Middle East saying, we are strong, and if you screw with us, we're going to send a really strong response back. That's just human nature. And as a friend of Israel, I say, there's no need to expand bloodshed. Being that today is February 22nd, and Israel gave a March 10th deadline, the beginning of Ramadan, to the other side to release the hostages, I see that as a break in the fighting that's sort of welcome. It gives around 19 days of respite, consideration of what the next move is. How much more pain will Hamas make their people go through because of their terrorism? How long will Hamas deprive the hostages of freedom that was stolen from them because they find joy in terrorizing Jews? I hope the 19 days is constructive to a peaceful period. I hope that the world can celebrate Ramadan with peace and the conflict in Gaza behind us. And I hope Gaza is rebuilt with some sort of security and faith that it'll have a prosperous future. It's such a shame that it devolved into the situation it did, and the billions of dollars went to supporting hate and an infrastructure that only facilitated such travesty like we see here. Hoping for peace, cessation of the killing, and never coming back to a situation like this. The only way it happens is we keep the discussions going, we're tolerant of the other side, and we know the answer lies somewhere in the reasonable middle. Hope to see you next time. Thank you for joining me, guys.